today's webinar along my colleague. I'll be moderating this webinar along my colleague Jose Sandoval, who is a PhD candidate also in learning design technology at Penn State University. In terms of the interactive format of this webinar, please use the chat feature in the Zoom platform if you have any questions about the presentation. Please use chat feature on Zoom. So you can see that the chat button at the bottom of the screen, the Q&A session will be at the end of the presentation. We'll be gathering all questions and we'll be just, raising them to the presenter. Our online Master Professional Studies and Organization Development change are designed for professionals who need the skills and knowledge to effectively lead change in their organization. Furthermore, there is a PhD program in workforce education development with a concentration in human resource development and organizational development. Our program has created a continuous monthly webinar series with experts around the world. Today, we are presenting Perspective, Driving Organization Performance by Understanding Other Points of View, presented by Dr. Robert Greggs. Dr. Robert Greggs studies leader and organizational performance. He's a task force senior trainer in the U.S. Army National Training Center Leadership Training Program. He's also the senior consultant for JKAN Consulting and has worked for and with Fortune 500 companies such as Amazon, FedEx, Ryder. Dr. Greggs has earned his PhD and Master in Education from Penn State University. He also holds a Master in National Policy and Security Studies from the U.S. Naval War College and a Bachelor of Business Administration from Campbell University. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Dr. Greggs. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Isa, for the introduction, and thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate all who have joined the webinar. As you may have known or picked up from Isa's introduction, my professional focus has been on and is currently on organizational leader performance. I've led large, complex organizations in some very trying circumstances, and I came to believe that I was good. I was a good and effective leader. I didn't often really know why I was good. After leaving military service, I was able to lead some very successful teams working for some well-established companies in the private sector. I had some leadership successes as well in the nonprofit space, but I still didn't know if I was an effective leader, why I was an effective leader. That all led me to my academic studies, driven to find an academic foundation to support my experience as a practitioner. One common issue that I now know I didn't get right was understanding perspective. Like many other leaders, I thought myself to be considerate. When first exposed to the idea of transformational versus transactional relationships in organizations, I felt I really understood why I wanted to be transformational, vice transactional, and I thought I knew what I needed to be a transformational leader. But what I've learned through the melding of my continuing to evolve academic work with my current professional work is that there is a complexity to perspective that many leaders either do not take the time to understand or do not see the need to want to understand better. And that's what I want to have a dialogue with all of you about today. Is there an understanding of perspective that can better drive organizational performance? I think there is, and we'll see if we can explore that today. This is the agenda that we'll be following. As Isa said at the end, I'll be more than happy to entertain your questions or hear your comments and thoughts. So my dissertation focused on the performance management of leaders to help organizations achieve intended outcomes. The busy diagram in front of you represents a strategic performance management for leaders model that I created that offers a process for organizations and their leaders to achieve those outcomes, heavily focused on proper direction setting, effective communication, buy-in, and repeated assessment. For today, the area that I will focus on is that strategic direction arrow in the middle needed to drive the process towards outcomes. Strategic direction is given by senior leaders, mostly through vision statement, strategic guidance, or other guidance as part of operational goals and objectives. It is a communication of that strategic direction that made me consider the role of perspective in determining the effectiveness and utility of a leader's guidance to set organizational direction. I remember earlier in my career, a very aggressive leader after giving our team guidance, not being very satisfied with our performance, said to the team, "I can say it louder and I can repeat it, but I can't be any more clear." In hierarchical organizations where I spent most of my professional career, this is the common sentiment. The leader is very, very confident in what they are saying, and their insistence that the problem is that the team or you all aren't understanding it drives their beliefs, and they do what I call dig in to their message. Similarly, during a discussion with an organizational leader recently about how they ensure their guidance is received and understood, this leader told me of his variation, and I've heard it a bunch of different ways, as many of you had, of the rule of three or similar rule. If I state all of my guidance or everything I want to say 3 times, I know the guidance is clearly received and understood. So to explain a little bit about my current work, I am retired from government service, but I really work in a contracted role with, as Isa mentioned, the National Training Center for the U.S. Army. I get to observe about 30 plus leaders a year for a period of about 8 to 10 days a month. I really can't do a lot of formal research as part of my work, and I cannot use my work directly as a back-end part of any research unless I go through a pretty rigorous process that I say rivals and surpasses Penn State's IRB process, which caused me most of the gray hairs that you may see later or see in my photos. However, I do and I can use my experience with these leaders to help drive my work and expand my academic work and professional work outside of the government consulting. And in this case, I've been using the observations to support my research and some of the meta research to better understand effective communication and perspective. So to set the foundation for this dialogue is I'd like to talk a little bit on factors that affect performance and that influence communication. So I get to observe leaders' interaction with their team multiple times a day in both formal and informal engagement. Leaders were very confident and are always very confident in giving guidance, but they really focus mostly on delivery of their message. And just to give you an example of number and quantity, over a 10-day period, there are generally 4 to 5 formal briefs that the leader and senior staff have with numerous other interactions. One of the conversations I have with senior leaders early on is to try to see if they understand or what their understanding is of what makes somebody proficient at a task. And hopefully this becomes apparent as to why this is so critical in knowing when understanding perspective. What I help them and what I have, my research has seen or what I have read is that to be proficient at a task or a skill or process, there are really 3 main elements that we need to build on. There's an education, both academic and professional education. There's training, and it's based on what was learned through the education process, how to do a task, skill, or process correctly. And then there's repetition, knowing what right looks like and practicing that good repetition repeatedly. This dialogue helps me understand or helps highlight for the leader the gap between their proficiency, often in education and training, so that their team is not able to produce or is not having as much experience with repetition, which really shows the gap in proficiency between the leader who's developing the messaging to the intended audience. And that gap in proficiency is important. So another element that is we need to talk about before we start talking about perspective is this idea of a transformative culture. I'll assume of the participants that would sign into a OD&C webinar, especially for our program from Penn State, you're probably all in on the transformative culture, vice the transactional nature of a business or element or a organization. I really try to find with leaders whether or not they find value in being transformational, and whether or not leading the transformational team or sustaining the transformational culture is important to them. Some primary considerations of committing to a transformational culture are elements of leader communication. Do they impact performance, or do they inhibit the building of the transformational culture? What are some of the contributing factors that prevent comprehension of a message from leader to team? Is that understood? And then I also look at, because I work mostly with hierarchical organizations, what are some of the other factors or considerations that, if understood, can then help improve communication, comprehension, performance, and outcome? And anytime it leads me to saying other considerations to understand, that makes me think of perspective. So with the importance, so understanding the importance of setting direction, which was that vision from my strategic performance management of leadership model, and knowing the importance of setting direction, understanding gaps in proficiency between a leader and the team, and with a feel for how committed to transformation of culture a leader wants to be, I can really focus then on an understanding of perspective. Many of you to this point may say, I got it. And maybe you do, but I didn't. And I don't find many leaders who understand perspective in a way that best facilitates effective communication to drive performance outcomes. And that's really the most important part of what my current work is. It's not just communicating well. It's not just giving good vision or understanding what they think perspective may be. And it's not just to facilitate continued effective communications. It's all of this to drive performance outcome. In observing leader communications, many leaders acknowledge the influence of perspective on communication and dialogue. Too often, though, this perspective is really post-communication. And that is one of the little hurdles that I have attempted to discern and then address and then have recommendations for. To truly understand perspective involves anticipating another's perspective and or continuously assessing effectiveness of communication from the perspective of the intended audience. So how does a leader understand gaps in perspective? How does a leader better understand the perspective of their intended audience? I like to sit down with leaders using a Pepsi bottle to help them do this, with all respect to Pepsi and any royalties that or any fines I should pay for using a Pepsi bottle. You can use any similar product if a Pepsi bottle doesn't work for you, if you prefer another type of product. Generally, if you just look at a Pepsi bottle and you put it directly between you and someone sitting across from you that represents your audience, you both are physically seeing the exact same thing. You both are seeing a cylindrical object, the bottle itself. It's clear, is the best way to kind of use this analogy. The blue cap is evident even in this picture. And there's a label around the center. Now, the way that we look at this label, I often take the leader through and I say, As the leader, if all of us are the leader on this side of the Pepsi bottle, I ask the person if they acknowledge the clear bottle, and they say they do. And do you see that it's generally shaped the way it's shaped? And they do. And do you see the blue label around the middle? And they do. And there's a blue cap, and they do. And I then explain to them there's a Pepsi logo, and it has a red, white, and blue circle that represents the brand. And do they see that? But as you can see on the picture in the middle of the slide, if they're on the other side of that bottle, they actually don't see the same thing that you see. Generally, they agree that they're looking at the same thing, but from their perspective, they in fact don't see that Pepsi with the red, white, and blue label. In this case, they will often see on a much bigger bottle, or someone with really small hands, they see the nutrition facts table. And for you, if you're understanding where I'm going with this, you can be a little frustrated because they're looking at the same thing you are, but what they say they see, or what they have gotten from you, isn't translating to the same picture. Both people are looking at the same bottle and the same label, but because of perspective, one sees one part of the label while the other sees something completely different. In ineffective communication, not trying to understand that this is possible really is a major hurdle. So for some, even the Pepsi bottle can be confusing. You have an insight into the other's point of view because you're able to go through and see that one of you is looking at the bottle from one side and the other person's looking at the bottle from the other side. But this is really too dramatic. I actually like to talk, as you see in the picture in the top right of the slide, about perspective being not a polar argument, this side or that side, with me or against me, but I like to talk about it relative to a 360-degree compass. I used to use a clock face, but I come to realize that when talking to people who have grown up in the last many years, much younger than I am, they don't know what a clock face necessarily is, or they're not as practiced with it. So the compass, I'm hoping, is always something I can talk to them more about. A compass is a 360-degree circle, and unlike the Pepsi bottle, it helps me really understand kind of how close we are to each other's perspective with a little bit more precision. So when understanding perspective, my experience has been that leaders are really comfortable wherever they are on the compass. The challenge is trying to discern through interaction and comprehension where the audience really is on the compass. Are they generally close? And you can use that determination as to being within about a 45-degree area? Or do they generally have an opposing point of view, 180 degrees or a little bit farther apart, although 180 is exactly the opposite? When you try to understand the perspective in those terms, what you can do then is really understand whether or not the gap in what you're communicating and what is being understood is a large gap or just a slight failure to comprehend as you intended. So if you can follow along to this point, which I'm sure that you can, and you understand the other's perspective, you really want to ask yourself, is it more effective or more efficient, to try to bring one to your perspective, to where you are on the compass, Or is it better to anchor continued dialogue against where the audience is on that compass? I don't think you're ever going to be precise. You're probably not exactly right as to where you are on this proverbial compass. And you may not be assessing correctly where they are. But my focus and work is usually with senior leaders, and many of you who are probably very experienced, either in the field of studying leadership or as leaders. You should realize that you have the skills, expertise, the proficiency, as I laid out earlier, to really be more flexible relative to perspective. In hierarchical organizations that I deal with, that learning and training and education gap often is represented by professional experience gaps of 10 to 15 years between a senior leader and the next level leaders. So 2 levels down. In some of the other organizations that I worked outside of the government, there were leaders that had been in the business segment for 8 to 10 years more than me as a direct report, and they knew the business much more so than I did. So when we have a gap in our understanding of communication or dialogue, it would seem to make more sense that they were better suited, trained, and practiced to move to help understand it from my point of view than to try to get me to understand it from their point of view, as I lacked their experience and their expertise, among other things. So as we apply this back to providing vision and guidance, one of the things that you can do is anticipate this with an assessment using the compass as to where kind of your team is on the compass, so they can best receive your message and craft the guidance accordingly. Anticipating the conversation and anticipating the probable reception, or looking for clues and indicators that will help you have a better understanding of what will resonate more with the audience, is one way that you can understand perspective as a way to help deliver a more effective vision or guidance. One of the things that you have to be realistic with and own is whether or not you are a fire and forget leader who gives guidance by just saying what I say, and then you come back to me and tell me kind of where you think the gaps are. Or do you look for indicators throughout your dialogue that lets you know that the audience may not be on the same part of the compass as you are? One of the challenges that leaders have, especially depending on the gap between them and their team, is making an assumption that my team is going to be honest with me with those gaps. And one of those elements that I'll talk about briefly later when I talk about strategies is prioritizing comprehension over acknowledgement. In hierarchical organizations, especially my experience, has been that the team is very likely to let you know, we acknowledge that you said something, but they won't use those words. You'll walk away thinking they comprehend it. And that's where some of the problems occur. So what are some of the strategies for improving communication? See, many of the leaders that I work with do not work to understand perspective because they really don't assess those gaps in the effectiveness of the message to their team. So before we can talk about strategies for improving communication, we need to make sure we understand that there may be not a problem, but an area that we can do better. I was listening to psychologist Elliot Aronson recently, who has a fascinating background, but he is the pioneer of research into cognitive dissonance. And it struck me that this is often what's kind of going on when it comes to what I'm talking to you about today. Leaders who just repeat the message 3 times, who say their message slower and louder, they don't really just see why their message isn't being received well. They are convinced that it has to be received well. Aronson in the interview talked about not about leadership and effective communication, but he then said the next step is a rationalization, that it really must be something. And for me, that made me think that the leaders often think there's a deficiency with their team that's causing the barrier or the hurdle, or there's friction that is inhibiting the effectiveness of the message, without really considering that it may be the way the message has been received based on the perspective of their audience. The challenge that I often have is with leaders is to help them see the benefits of considering that perspective when crafting the message before initial communication, and then strive to create messages based on more descriptive and a less prescriptive framework. So as we talk about strategies for improving communication, that descriptive versus prescriptive framework is something that's been really a focus of mine probably for the last 7 or 8 months. How many times that I'm able to sit down with a leader and ask them if they are being very prescriptive at all the things they want to do, or do they really understand there may be greater value in establishing a more broad direction initially, and then through subsequent dialogue, they are able to get feedback that they can ingest and then help refine direction of the team to go where the leader actually intended. When I did my research for my PhD, one of the things that came up through the interviews that I did was, in reflection, the leaders that I interviewed were really clear that this prescription versus description really was a big stumbling block. A couple highlights of that that I focused on was those of us who have led, who got frustrated because we say that we want to be a transformational leader, and we say that we don't want to be overly prescriptive, but when our team does something that we want them to do, but they don't do it exactly as we want it, it frustrates us, and that mismatch kind of erodes at the effective communication part of leading organization. In those instances, with my current work, I try to help the leaders see that they think they're being descriptive while being okay with the methods and processes the team wants to do, valuing the outcome more. But in fact, they're really prescriptive, and they want things done as they would do them, or and they believe the outcome will be just as good or just sufficient. And so that's a constant dialogue I have with helping leaders better work to improve communication. I really like to have leaders sit down and try to figure out how are they planning to ensure comprehension. A deliberate plan, and this really ties into another part of my work that I think influences outcomes assessments, is something that I don't see a lot of leaders do when crafting guidance or giving a vision. Honestly, in government organizations, with the leader changeover happening so frequently, in many cases every 2 years, if not sooner, every new leader sits down and makes a vision. In my current position as a government consultant, I've been doing it for 5 years. I don't know that I've ran across one who has ever refined their vision at any point along their 2 years in their leadership position. It's kind of amazing to me. And then the other part of it is So having a plan to assess, uh, how do I know that the plan is being comprehended and whether or not the team is embracing it and whether or not they're taking ownership of it is something that a leader should do prior uh, to delivering messages. Then the other part is always valuing comprehension over acknowledgement. Think about all of us whenever we first started our jobs early on as a leader in any position, really, however it affected you. But how many times has somebody said to you something, 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 and Rob, do you understand? Oftentimes the answer is yes, I do. And I like to do a little drill with some leaders when trying to keep it a little bit lighter. And I'll always try to ask them, when you say you understand, do you comprehend what they said and what they're asking you to do? Or are you just acknowledging they said something and you want this interaction to end as quick as possible? It's really striking when you see a senior vice president talking to uh, a new college graduate as a first line level leader, a direct report manager. And this senior vice president comes in and asks this person about, hey, what are the three most important things to this company for to make sure we have a good customer experience, or whatever the vignette is you want to build it around. And that new leader tries to do the best they can from memory. And but the truth is that new leader just wants that vice president to leave as soon as possible. That is trying to determine whether or not we are acknowledge or valuing comprehension over acknowledgement. Effective leaders take the time to have multiple touch points to try to understand, as we talked about earlier, where the team member or the team is on that compass, and be willing to adapt and modify the message to try to get it to where the person can best receive it. And then if there needs to be some modification to bring that person to your spot on the compass, to adjust the message accordingly. So as we get to about 35 minutes in, I want to give you all just a few things to think about. In the short time we've had today, I really focus on driving organizational performance outcomes. And it's based on one's ability to effectively communicate. The transformational cultures and buy-in are really based on this effective communication. My experience has been through both research and experience, professional experience. Leaders communicate confidently, but often this is their point of view from which they base, as opposed to the point of view of the intended audience. I like to think of those interactions using the face of a 360-degree compass, so I can better determine just how far apart on what you are hearing or receiving or understanding and what I'm trying to say. Craft the message thinking about not only what you want to communicate, but what will be received based on where that audience is. If you do that ahead of time and you plan and you continually assess, you'll find a better opportunity to ensuring effective messaging, which is the whole key of your purpose as a senior leader. And then look for those indicators of comprehension and acknowledgement. One of the phrases, the bumper stickers, if you will, that I've really been working on with leaders the last couple months, and I just returned from a trip, and the feedback has been very positive, and I'll continue to follow up on it, is to conversationally follow if you're a leader. The more that you can talk to your team and quickly get them to talk about what you want to talk about, because of your education, your training, and your repetition or experience, conversationally following your team will help craft that conversation and messaging to a place where you can steer it, as opposed to falling into the trap of just saying something clearer and louder. So some of the key references that I used, I just highlighted here because Isa gave me one slide to show key references. My own dissertation is on there. A couple books, or a book by Adam Grant, Think Again, has been pretty enlightening post my PhD work, and I recommend that among other things. And then a couple good articles among many. My dissertation has other key references that influence my work here. Thank you all again for your time today. And with that, I'll answer any questions you might have or consider any comments or observations. I'm always up for more dialogue on this subject and most anything involving leader and organizational performance. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Isa.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rob. It was very interactive, very interesting presentation. Although, I had the slides before, but I was very, very interested and just listening exactly to your exploration regarding the point that you raised. Yes, we received a couple of questions here. I will start the first one here. Someone asked about how you recommend to build an effective organizational performance in times of wars, pandemics, or natural disasters.
So I think what's interesting about the question, Isa, is the element of time. Now, time, when I hear time, we often think about the pressure of time. So the two parts that I would say, and I, good, bad, or indifferent, I have had most of my professional experience, a lot of it, about 6 years of it, has been overseas in very difficult times. So one is you can't build that culture then. If you take the recent COVID pandemic, having the team under pressure with all the stressors, fatigue, and all the other pressures, the team's effectiveness needs to be established before then. So all of these strategies that I shared with today, I think I would implement as soon as we can and refine it and make it as good of a system based on the team you have. And as you change out the team, continue to refine it. Then the second thing is to take the time. A lot of these strategies, the first thing that I often hear is, I don't have a lot of time to have this type of deliberate interaction with my team. And that's very disappointing and kind of sad to me. And so what I'll do is I will say to them, and I mean this sincerely, as a consultant, if I can ever help a unit find a problem that's relative to time and not having enough of it, it's probably the easiest money I can make, because schedule and time inefficiencies permeate through almost every organization that I see. So I hope I'm answering your question. Work on it now, create that culture and community of dialogue and interaction, strive to be a leader that values perspective. And then when you realize that it's all about time, just become more efficient with the time and commit to this process and commit to effective communication, direction setting by understanding perspective.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. The next question here, we received something about, from your experience as a consultant and a leader, what do you think is the most recognized or maybe hidden constraint for understanding other perspectives and how to overcome it?
So I think there's two. One of them, I really appreciate these questions. The one is biases, and sometimes it's a personal bias, and sometimes there's organizational influence biases. Like a good example is operational people who grew up, who were leaders, who have a bias against, and I'm just totally making this up, engineers, or whatever it is. So organizational or personal biases, that's a huge hurdle to some of this. We don't recognize we have the bias, which is why I came up with the Pepsi bottle and then the compass, instead of sitting there wondering kind of why don't I think this person gets it, really trying to understand this other person's perspective and point of view. My experience has been, if you do that, you kind of have to work around the biases, because you set aside wherever they are or why they're there, because you're trying to understand it from their perspective. So biases is probably the biggest hurdle to all of that. Time is the other major hurdle. The other one is not everything we do as a leader, as many of you know, are based on victories. And sometimes there'll be people in the organization that won't appreciate your efforts in this. And what that really has nothing to do with that effective communication. That's somebody who has not been made to understand the culture that you're trying to build or the approach that you're trying to have by being more participative and more transformational. And so that's a different conversation. So we often, in my consultancy especially, it's trying to help identify and address the right problem. And sometimes that maybe it's a culture fit, or maybe it's an understanding of what we're trying to be about fit. And maybe the person you're talking to just doesn't value the interaction. But those are some things I have really kind of seen as the major hurdle.
Thank you so much. We got another question. With regard to keeping the perspective of other person in mind, as well as keeping in mind how far away you may be from them on the compass, how do you help the other person to take more ownership of their comprehension? And the comment was, I often work with clients who are passive and expect to be fed rather than actively understand.
So I really like the question, and it's really one of the ones that I probably have made. I mean, I don't know if I'm any good or not, but if I've grown. So the first thing I would say is get the first victory. The first victory is letting the person know and being receptive to their perspective matters. So I like how you brought it back to the compass. And when my experience and my recommendation is, without knowing any more of the details, is when you start to establish that their perspective matters and is of value, then you often find some of the other added benefits are that person then really believes that you are committed to sincere and effective communication. So when you have harder communications later, like taking ownership, or other communications later, like having them be more committed in your mind to kind of some of the things they're doing, those difficult conversations are easier, because you really, if you think about it as having established a good foundation of trust. Too often, and I'm not saying that you implied this in your question, but in some cases, we are frustrated by their lack of ownership, and it influences our communication, which goes back again to not understanding their perspective. So one thing that is a little bit outside the scope of what we're talking about today, but definitely influences my work, is just go ahead and set the foundation by understanding their perspective, so that you can have more difficult conversations later. And hopefully in subsequent conversations, you'll find that the gap between where you are and where they are on the compass is not as big as it once was. So I hope that helps you out a little bit.
Okay, thank you so much. We got another question. Do these personal biases can be deliberate?
The personal biases of the leader are absolutely deliberate, especially again in when I look at different levels. So if you look at the director or group level, or even into the C-suite level, the times that I've worked with people at the C-suite level or in the senior hierarchical level of the military, it's really challenging. Who in the organization is going to remind the person that their biases are negatively influencing their message? I mean, that's a tough conversation to have. That, as I mentioned before, some of the leaders that influenced me to even be curious in this were the ones that, said, I'll say it louder and I'll say it slower, but I can't say it clearer. So who in your organization or who in an organization can help that leader help them understand their biases and some of the hurdles, or give them that feedback? When I said plan assessments, one of the things, and it's a little bit different because I'm not working with the most senior leaders, but one of the things is I try to help ask a leader to say, who are you getting feedback from? And that's something that that I think I try to get as a leader. I try to get feedback from anybody that will give me feedback. I appreciated Isa looking over my slides earlier and just telling me that everything is going to be okay. And Jose on our prep for this. Feedback is always good, but it takes a special kind of leader to recognize that I don't have anybody in my organization that really I trust giving me that feedback, and so therefore my biases could go unchecked. So take a step back and find somebody that can provide you that tap on the shoulder when your biases, in their opinion, are influencing your messaging.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rob. We got another question here. How can leaders encourage their direct reports to give them feedback?
Say that one more time, Isa, please. Sorry.
How can leaders encourage their direct reports to give them feedback?
So I don't know that this in practice is as challenging as it seemed to me when earlier in my career. One of them is to just ask directly. Now, where they are when you ask them, like in what format, the more relaxed they are. I often had an office away from everybody. I had a nice desk often places, as many of us do in our offices. If I bring somebody in my office and sit them down across from a physical structure, which is my desk, and I ask them for feedback, it's probably a different dynamic than if I go down to their work area or if I see them walking and I just ask if they have a minute and ask for their sincere feedback then. The environment in which you communicate, it really has shown to impact the effectiveness of whether or not that communication has been comprehended or acknowledged. I literally, as I mentioned earlier, that I use as a way of introducing just some levity to the situation is sometimes just ask somebody after you talk to them, are you acknowledging that I said something because you want this interaction to end, or do you really comprehend it? But short of my bad jokes, or my attempt to be light, I would say just think about when you're asking and what the environment is and where you're asking, but be sincere about it and be ready for some of that feedback. The other thing that you can do, I've stood in front of large groups and done all hands messages and talked to large auditoriums of members of my organization and their families. Try to find people that you are kind of not, part of your upper team, and just look for that body language that makes you just get a sense that, hey, they're not really receptive to this. And then just try to, figure out kind of where they are on that compass so that you can really understand what about it was I saying that really didn't seem to resonate. Sometimes you'll find it's because something else happened to influence it, or it wasn't what you thought it was. But most of the leaders that I work with are senior enough where they shouldn't discount the body messages and the signals that they're receiving to make them feel that the message is not being well received. But one of the big takeaways is when you ask the question, what that current environment is, really helps determine the odds of getting a good, honest answer. So that's a great question.
Thank you so much. And also we have another long question. I think it's more than it's a feedback reflection more than a question. When a senior leadership CEO needs to be constantly reminded to conduct tasks that directly affect workforce culture, morale, like spending time on the shop floor, one-on-one talks with mid-level managers, etc. How best to remind them without becoming a pest? Putting these times on their calendar is ignored, and I find myself needing to be the one making sure these comments are being met, usually after 3-4 reminders.
Yeah, so it's really interesting that I was never one. I think there's a fine balance, Isa, as I understand the comment or the concern. I was not one. I appreciated that I didn't like super senior leaders, or when I was a senior leader, to just make surprise unannounced visits. I think in reflection, what I found is that if if that really disrupts the organization, part of it is because you're making them surprise unannounced visits. What I found in one of my work in a very successful internet retailer is if I was just around and not and just asking people how they're doing and out and around, then my presence wasn't as disruptive. The other part is I've been in the position of what I think that the author of the question was kind of implying was with those interactions. Sometimes if you're one of the middle managers or the current operational manager, how do you make sure that all that stuff gets done and it becomes taxing and time consuming? And that's just an evolution of the culture and the dialogue. If you are frustrated sometimes that your senior level leader is disruptive, I'm a big fan of communicating up. Like that was the other area that I would have focused on if Issa said he didn't want to hear about perspective. I would have tried to do a webinar on communicating up. But sometimes those frictions and barriers can really be addressed through just having some